Welcome, everybody. Hey, emotions have been all over the place, right? Last couple days. I feel like I've been on my phone for the last since Tuesday morning or something, Tuesday afternoon. Unfortunately or fortunately, however you look at this, we are all here today because we underachieved in 2023. We all did. And now we're in a situation where, we all need to get better. And we understand that the 12s, the fans, the community, Jody, everybody in this building deserves better. We had high expectations for 2023. We overachieved in 2022, and quite frankly, we underachieved in 2023. And I think everybody recognizes that. But again, it's a time for all of us to look in the mirror in this organization, myself included, obviously, and improve, learn, and move forward. Pete Carroll. So Pete and I could split today and have podcasts for years on end and just sit and riff about all the decisions, all the discussions, all the debates, the ups, the downs, everything we've been through. We've been so blessed to have that relationship. I consider myself extremely fortunate to have hooked up with Pete 15 years ago now. And I find it very ironic that we're sitting up here today embarking on a head coaching search when, again, 15 years ago I thought I was going to be doing that. I was preparing for that, like at that moment. I had 36 pages of coaching material in my big book for Todd Lawicki and Mr. Allen, and I had to rip the 36 pages out of there because they had hired Pete. And Todd did an incredible job of working through that situation, and Lance Lopes as well, talking me into coming out here and interviewing and sitting down with Pete and coming up with a great solution. And again, just very, very blessed to have worked with Pete and all the positive lessons and the leadership lessons and thoughts and philosophies. And I can't even begin to explain to you, pretty emotional press conference the other day. And when I say your emotions are all over the place, it's moving on from a very, very historic partnership and amazing level of success and achievement that Pete and myself are extremely proud of. I look forward to being able to call up Pete and text him. He's texting me like crazy all the time, like, "Hey Johnny, what's going on with this and that?" And so it's been a great experience. So here we go. We have a clear directive from Jody Allen moving forward as we embark on our new coaching search. It's clear, it's concise. We want to keep our positive culture, everything that's been created here, everything in this building. There's so many special people in this building. It's amazing to be on the phone with all these agents and the people that are interested in this position, and to be able to explain to them, hey, there's a foundation here that's incredible. Chuck Arnold, our president, started here as an intern. So Chuck and Dave and, Karen Spencer and Cindy, Mo Kelly, the people, and I hate to skip anybody, but those foundational people, EK, sorry, they were here since the West was won, basically. And just excited for this new individual to partner with. and move forward. It's already clear in talking to all these people that where we're going and how we're going to evolve. All the people that are interested in this, and our sports science staff, the trainers, our nutrition, everything we've built over the years. I mean, our kitchen staff is like world renowned, basically. I mean, Stu McNabb's doing interviews for local magazines and stuff. This guy's, it's amazing. But we have a great foundation here, a great culture, the stadium. Again, like the fans, the stadium's so loud, right on the water here. People back you. It's just, it's been exciting. It's been exciting to talk to people about that. And we've been blessed to have great relationships with legendary coaches, close working relationships with legendary coaches over the years. Mike Holmgren, Marty Schottenheimer, Mike McCarthy, who's the Packers' all-time winningest coach, and obviously Coach Carroll. So we know what success and a great partnership looks like, and really, really looking forward to learning as much as we can throughout this process as we embark on a new coaching search that has already begun. And like my good friend Andy Reid says, the time is yours.
Question? John, you've talked about excitement and you've talked about all these people. What excites you most about getting a chance to go through this process?
I think the learning, evolving, looking forward, where's the game going? 14 years is a long time for one coach to be in a spot, right? And it's been incredible. God rest his soul, Marty Schottenheimer would always tell me, one coach can't stay in one spot for more than 10 years. He retired when I was with him in Kansas City for a year. And it's just that opportunity to learn from all these people that are doing incredible things, in college football and around the National Football League. And you cannot, if you're stagnant in this league, you're behind. So I think that's probably the most intriguing thing, is to learn and be open-minded.
John, what can you tell us about where things stand right now with the search?
We're very much in the initial. There's initial processes, right? So 15 years ago, it was a totally different setup. There's a lot of things we need to a lot of boxes that need to be checked, and we need to make sure we're staying instead with all the rules that are put in place. We've sent in several consent forms, and we're hoping to begin interviews tomorrow.
John, you mentioned stagnant there for that word.
Yeah.
Did you feel things have become kind of stagnant?
Not necessarily. I think it's more of like a growth. Like, okay, it's how are we getting better every day? I think Pete would tell you that. His motto is always like, "What's next?" Right? So, how are we? Maybe stagnant's not the best term, but how are we learning? How are we going to crush this thing moving forward and keep everybody? We always talk about coming to work every day, knowing what kind of influence you're going to have on the organization. That's what makes a great culture. And Pete and I are very proud of the culture that we established here. And so I think that the thought of everybody, again, looking in the mirror, that's what that means, and that's every individual in the organization, whether it's in ticketing or marketing or college scouting or nutrition, equipment, whatever. What are we doing to get better every single day, and what kind of influence am I having on the organization? And my previous experience in going through this is that again, this was with Mike McCarthy's search. It was a long time ago with Ted Thompson, but we learned so much. So it's not necessarily about where we've been, but it's about how much you can just grow.
John, you mentioned 14 years ago you had your notes, 36 pages, what you wanted in hiring. How over the last 14 years has what you're looking for in a coach maybe evolved or changed? Obviously the names are different, but just maybe the experience you've had these 14 years changed what you're looking for.
It's a great question, John. We in going through the questionnaire, in looking over all the questions, I didn't have sports science in there. I didn't have a heavy load of analytics in there. So I think that's probably the two things that are that stand out the most. How that's evolved, return to play, knowing when to take players off the field and balancing that with the coaching staff for practice. What does that look like to people? I think that's probably but when you get into, the leadership, strategic, advancements, all that kind of stuff, that's all pretty much stayed the same. I mean, not the strategic part, obviously, with the analytics, but those two things stand out, sports science and analytics.
You said the directive from ownership is to maintain your culture. What qualities are you going to prioritize as you look for a head coach?
That's it. Our culture, and then how are we evolving? Who's going to help us move to the next level, right? How are we going to, compete with everybody that we need to compete with and advance this organization moving forward? And that's I think we're going to learn so much of this process about the ideas, and I'm proud of all the connections we have around the National Football League, and we've learned a lot already. And so to be able to understand what that looks like, different opinions, different philosophies, open the door to different ideas, whether it's a defensive head coach or a offensive head coach or a special teams guy that is becoming a head coach. I think that's all just really, really important.
You mentioned underachieving this year. Could you put your finger on a reason or two why you think that happened? And I guess how surprised were you that you guys didn't take that step forward this year?
Disappointed. I think everybody was very disappointed. We had several games that, just got out of control a little bit. And so, yeah, I would say disappointed. I'm not going to get into specifics. Bob, I hope you can respect that.
John, how does your role change now, if at all?
Great question. Basically, the role changes. Our setup earlier was, and it's been a question for a number of years, the coaching staff did not fall under my umbrella, and now it will. And it's not necessarily a Jody Allen decision or choosing this person or that person. It's just a contractual situation.
Is there
John,
one
you
person?
Pete said last week he was competing to stay, to keep the job. What was the process like for you? Did you have those same conversations with Jody? And I mean, the guy that you worked so closely with was like, I don't know if you have to sign off on that, but how did that conversation go?
I'm not going to get into the specifics of the conversations. Those are very confidential and very private. I would say that Pete knew, how I felt about things and where we needed to improve. And Jody knew my opinions as well.
John, just to clarify your role, is it your understanding that you will have final say over personnel decisions regardless of who the coach is?
Yes.
Is there one person or experience that has shaped the criteria that you look for in a coach more than others?
No, I would say that, my initial experience with Ron Wolf, my mentor who I spent a lot of time with on Friday afternoon, which was awesome, speaking with him. But no, I think his ability to push me out the door at a young age, 25 years old, and go, work closely with Marty Schottenheimer and Carl Peterson in Kansas City. They were an extremely successful organization at the time as well. He recognized that I needed to grow and get out of the Packer organization. And so being able to, work with Marty and Terry Bradway and, Mike McCarthy was on that staff, having come from Green Bay where it was, Coach Holmgren and Andy Reid and John Gruden and Marty Moore. I mean, the staff was, Mooch. I mean, it was an incredible staff that Coach Holmgren put together. So I would say just over the years, just the experiences of, moving back to Washington with Coach Schottenheimer for 1 year and experiencing different ownership groups as well, like the variety of ownership groups, the wide range of leadership responsibility or demands, and from Lamar Hunt to going to Washington to going back to the Packers, working closely with Mr. Allen. I remember sitting upstairs in that room interviewing. I felt like I was 30 yards away from Tyler Wicke and Mr. Allen. I'm thinking to myself, wait, that's the guy that started at Microsoft. What am I doing interviewing with this guy? So no, all the lessons learned there. Paul was an extremely challenging. He challenged your brain. He was just an amazing individual to work for.
John, without getting into specifics, what is the makeup of the team you have right now?
I think it's a young, talented team that is, feels like they're right on the cusp. I think there's a lot of guys that have a ton of confidence in their abilities. They're all very highly disappointed in what just happened. I think to a man, they would all tell you that, and I know this from the exit interviews that I had, that we still should be playing, and everybody was very disappointed. But I think it's a great core. I think I think we're a very attractive job because of that. There's young talent all over the place. I think we're the fourth youngest team in the league or something like that. And the Packers were number one, I guess, first team since 1977 to make the playoffs. So, yeah.
John, Pete has said that he felt the team was still close. Do you feel like you guys are close to being of championship caliber?
I do.
Going back to Ian's question about timing on all of this and discussions behind the scenes, did you have any sort of indication, say in the last month of the season, that there might be a change in the coaching position?
When you work with Pete, his brain's on fire, and so you have to be ready for everything. So for me, the last several years, I've always been ready if he just decided at one point to, he said to me one day, several years ago, Johnny, I'm going to go change the world. And I'm like, I get it. You probably could, So I've always had to be ready. I've always had to have a list and try to be in the midst of what the landscape looks like around the National Football League, and our staff does a great job with that. Again, I'm really proud of all the relationships that our personnel staff, our scouts, people in the building that we have, and our reputation around the National Football League, like a low ego, well-communicating, easy group of people that can learn a lot from their relationships.
What was the internal players' reaction, and how have you had to navigate that the last week?
I actually haven't spoken to many of the players yet. That's something that once we get organized here, and it's a very competitive situation right now. So once we get past that, I'll be able to speak to the players and let them know what's going on. But right now, our primary focus is on competing with these other teams and trying to hire the best coach we possibly can to advance this deal forward.
Was your view different than Pete Carroll's, and that ultimately was the decision
My view different?
towards the future and where the team needed to go?
It's it's a good question, but it's different every year. Every year at this time, we sit down and we have conversations about where we're headed in this direction or where we're headed in that direction. So, different? No, not necessarily.
John,
Especially at this time of the year. You get this is again our least favorite time of the year. Whether you're connected to, whether it's directly with your team or you're connected to friends on other teams, it's always the worst time of the year when you have friends and families leaving teams or moving on to different teams, and you're trying to help people get hired at other places, or whatever that looks like. It's just we're all blessed to work in the National Football League, but we know what we're definitely getting into and what the ramifications are in a result oriented industry.
John, how wide of a net are you going to cast here for candidates to look at? I think there's been 6 reportedly tied to you for interviews so far. How many is too many? Like, what's the reach you're going to look at here?
No, too many is not too many. We'll handle it, just like our free agency process, our draft process. We're already in everything. Anybody, that you can pretty much think of. I had a gentleman email me the other day, whose buddy is the Pop Warner coach down the road, and he's extremely interested too. So it's just really been amazing, like the calls and the notes and everything you get. It's really I don't want to say a confidence booster, but I think it's a great reputation for this organization, and like a really cool feeling throughout the National Football League of what people think of this organization on the outside. And so it's again, it's a very, I think people recognize it's a very intriguing job, and one that you can come in and you know, have a great partnership with everybody here, and get rolling. I think people recognize that.
And how are you going to handle candidates who are still on teams that are playing the roles there and being unable to talk to them in certain stretches? Like, are those candidates still going to be among your process?
Yes, they will be.
Does it
There's
surprise you?
there's obviously certain rules that we need to abide by.
Does it surprise you, the interest around the league? I mean, you know that you've built a great culture here, but does that surprise you that you've heard from so many people?
I think yes and no. You know, I think we all go through periods during the season when we kind of have our heads buried in the sand because we're all working so hard at what we're doing. You know, if it's you know, it's scouting, it's, you know, working in the equipment room or upstairs in the cafeteria or whatever. You kind of just you're so dialed in and focused, but then you step back and you know, you think about, you know, everything our group does at the combine, or you know, conversations at owners meetings, or any opportunities at games to interact with people from other clubs. And so I think people recognize again that, you know, we have great ownership, we have great fans, that the culture's always been phenomenal here. You know, I was here in 2000 with Coach Holmgren and Ted and that group, and that's, you know, when I got to know Dave and EK and Karen and Chuck and Cindy and everybody, and that's why in 2000 and I forget what year it was, when Tim Ruskell was hired, I was disappointed that I didn't get to call the interview for it. But in 2010, I was really excited to feel like, yeah, to be able to come back here, to know this is such a awesome place to work and to live and to thrive.
How much say will Jody have in the process?
A lot. She's our boss. Yeah. You have a boss, right? Yeah.
John,
John, the last quarter century, this franchise has had previous head coaches take this job. How philosophically do you value a guy who's either a head coach now or has been a head coach versus someone who hasn't?
Yeah, it's a balance. It's definitely a balance. Are you gonna take a shot with somebody that's never been a head coach, that hasn't necessarily had those ups and downs? I mean, there's some hard things to go through. I think Pete alluded to that in his press conference the other day. It's a hard job. You know, you're going to go through some pretty dark times, and then, you know, you're going to go through some great times too. The key is to stay right in the middle of that and not be on a roller coaster, and to know that when you win a game, it doesn't mean you have all the answers and you're the best thing going. And then when you lose a game, you're not the worst team in the National Football League and you don't have any good players. So the balance is to be right in the middle of that. And so there's something to be said for that experience, absolutely. You know, people going through tough times with the media, or, you know, just any of the pressures. People are high-end achievers in this industry, as you've been exposed to, and they put a ton of pressure on themselves. So, you know, our key here is to let people know that they're going to have people that they have a strong foundation of people that are going to help them be the best head coach, you know, and have the best staff that they could possibly have. And they're going to know that we can support them, whether they've been a head coach or they haven't been a head coach. But that's a great philosophical head coaching, you know, search question for sure.
John, do you anticipate speaking to any college coaches, or do you think this will be an NFL-specific search?
I'm not sure yet. We haven't decided that. You know, it's wide open still. You know, there's so much movement in college football already. I mean, you just saw, congratulations to Jed. You know, Jed was with us right when we got here. I totally could have told you 15 years later that he would have been the head coach at the University of Washington when we hung out those first couple of days together. No, but congratulations to Jed and his staff, and best of luck with him. But there's so much late movement. You know, I started tracking it early. My son's at Boise, Jack's at Boise, and working in recruiting, and so, you know, they went through a coaching change, you know, 2 months ago or something. So you think about how far along they are in their process. It makes it slightly more difficult for those individuals. You know, they have to balance the fact of leaving these young men that these young people that they've recruited.
Pete had the role of advisor mentioned. Will he?
Yeah.
Yeah. Is there more clarity what that would be, or will he have?
No, there's not. I think it's something that we'll just keep researching in the future and discussing, and, you know, seeing how this goes. I mean, it's I feel like, Jody and Pete got to a great spot, and the organization's is very healthy and, ready to move forward.
John, what did you think
Personally-
of Gino's season?
I think Gino had a good season. It was a little bit opposite of last year. He started out real strong last year, and, things, dipped a little bit the second half. And then I thought, this year he started out not quite as strong as last year and then finished in a real strong manner.
Personally, John, what's this opportunity mean for you? To get a shot to run the franchise after 14 years?
I don't feel like it's like I haven't been running the organization. I understand the question, but I feel like I don't feel like there's been necessarily just one person running the organization.
Last question, Ian?
Yeah, just, is there a balance, you mentioned offensive coach, defensive coach, special teams coach, and all three are in the playoffs still. Do you lean towards one? Does that make a difference at all in today's NFL if a guy's an offensive guy or a defensive guy and that's his background?
I think you definitely have to look at the history. You have to look at, the different experiences that those individuals have had. We've done a ton of study on that already. We've been looking at it for years. Special teams coaches, especially when you look at Coach Harbaugh, I apologize for some of the other coaches that I'm missing there, but he stands out with all the success they've had in Baltimore. And, when you're the special teams coach, you have a really good feel for, and you're in the midst of who's going to be inactive, active all throughout the week, and the planning on both sides of the ball with, the offensive staff and the defensive staff, and what both groups are looking for. And so there's a balance too of, okay, if you hire a defensive coach, and he hires a really good offensive coordinator, and then that offensive coordinator is going to leave the next year, then what kind of consistency are you going to have with the quarterback? If you go back and look at, the San Francisco 49ers, when we hired Coach McCarthy in Green Bay, they had just drafted Alex Smith, and so they had like 3 different offensive coordinators, so that got things, a little bit wonky for his career early in the mix. So you have to look at those things, and if you hire a great offensive coordinator or a guy that's going to be a good play caller, where's the strength as the defensive coordinator, and, what kind of consistency and philosophy, strategy is that guy going to have, and how long is he going to be able to stick around too? So staff development and procurement, I think that's extremely important, regardless if it's a offensive guy, defensive guy, or special teams guy.
Okay, thank you, everyone.